Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Huge rumours in the driver market today are not about Max Verstappen, but one of his former teammates at Red Bull Racing who could be joining Cadillac's Formula 1 project for next year and potentially beyond. But his other driver in the car has definitely caused controversy today. The rumour has it there are two drivers in deep negotiations with Cadillac. Will this come to fruition? Is it all about the money? At the end of the day, definitely intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate. We are 1 week away from the Miami Grand Prix. A big weekend, of course, last year was the scene of the crime for Lando Norris finally getting his first win on the board. Max Verstappen was leading, hits the bollard, the damage happens, etc, etc. The McLaren that weekend, they brought upgrades and they worked spectacularly, and it feels quite a long time ago now that McLaren made that massive comeback that happened. And of course, Max Verstappen after the Grand Prix was very happy that his friend Lando Norris had got the Grand Prix win. Got a little bit spicier between the pair of them as the season went on. This season so far, despite the fact that Lando has not performed at the level that he wants to, he is behind Piastri, but he is still ahead of Max Verstappen in the championship as it stands. Norris said after Saudi he is not competing at the level needed yet to win this title. But Miami was a massive year for him last year, a massive race for him last year in the context of that season. If he can turn it around and deliver a masterclass this upcoming weekend again, then that potentially changes the tides of the battle this year. This is pretty interesting. I know it's one of these kind of fraudulent stats, whatever you want to say, but every season that a Grand Prix has landed on the 4th of May, which clearly hasn't happened very often at all, either the pole sitter or the race winner went on to win the championship. So take this as you will, but look, Jackie Stewart in 1969 at the Spanish Grand Prix, he won the race, went on to win the world title. Alan Jones in 1980 was on pole for what seems to be the Belgian Grand Prix, went on to win that, and then Michael Schumacher in 2003 won the Spanish Grand Prix from pole position. So historically speaking, whoever is either on pole or who wins is likely to be the champion. I mean, we'll see. Realistically, there are three contenders for this year's World Championship. Russell and Mercedes are probably too far out of the picture. I think it's possible, maybe, but they're going to have to bring some big upgrades. And frankly, I don't think Mercedes will, just because they seem confident that 2026 is going to be great. I think a lot of their focus is going to go there. We'll discuss more on that in a second. But just a stat to keep your eyes on when we get to Miami this weekend. Before we go any further, what about this as an idea? So the stewards, or the FIA certainly, the governing body, are certainly considering options to make the races more entertaining. Now, we know that the tyres are a massive point of controversy. There are some theories as to what they might do to resolve the issues. We've seen quite a few one-stops so far this year. One-stops, generally speaking, aren't great. The tyres can, I mean, honestly, the hard tyre, it looks like, can do the entire race without degrading at all, which is generally a massive issue. So the Pirelli manufacturers and the FIA have moved towards using softer compounds, although what about a world where, you know, we, instead of using C1, C2, C3, instead we're using C1, C3, C5, or C2, C4, C5, or something like that. You know, slightly more offset in the compounds might be something to think about. But if the tyre compounds are what they are, the other potential solution is to mess around with the pit stops in their entirety, and with the intention maybe of increasing the pit lane speed limit. Now, back in the day, there was no pit lane speed limit, and you could do whatever you wanted, just ramming it out of the pit lane at 200 kph. It was dangerous, and they got rid of that for a very good reason, especially nowadays with the number of unsafe releases that we have. I mean, imagine an unsafe release, but instead of the car bombing down the pit lane at 80 kph, they're coming down there at 200 kph. Bit of an issue there. So, and even you guys remember when the photographers, it was Baku a couple of years ago, the photographers were like on the track and Ocon came into the pits to do his stop because they hadn't realized he still had to stop. I think that was, you know, when he was in Alpine. That happens. If there was no pit lane speed limiter, that's, you know, you potentially got a serious accident on your hands. That thankfully didn't happen at the time, but it was certainly a point of contention. So fast forward to the present day, the pit stop speed limit or the pit lane speed limit is typically 80 kilometers an hour. At some Grand Prix tracks like Silverstone and I think maybe Singapore and a couple of others, France I think was like this as well. There's a few others that are kind of skipping my mind, but there's a 60 kph speed limit on some circuits. Most is 80, and it's been that way for some time. I think it used to be 100 for several years before they dropped it down to 80. Now, let's say they put it back to 100, right? 100 kph speed limit. And look, at the end of the day, the speed limit exists for a reason, for safety reasons, but the argument might be if you increase the limits that the teams can have in the pit lane so they can drive at 120 kph, 150 kph, or, that seems a bit much. But even if you increase it by 20 kilometers an hour, that means that the pit stop takes less seconds overall, reduces the total pit stop time by a couple of seconds that the teams are out of the race, and therefore it makes a two-stop more viable. Is it the best solution? No, not as far as I'm concerned. I'm still kind of in favour, if I had to make a rule change, is to mandate all three compounds. Like, I don't mind the idea of a one-stop versus a two-stop. Like, the one-stop could work if they can hold on. The two-stop is maybe what most people do, and the one-stop's kind of like a Hail Mary that sometimes might work. I don't mind that idea, but, if we had to use hard, medium, soft every Grand Prix, I do think on average the Grand Prix would be more entertaining, and it'd be more likely that we ended up getting, two-stop versus three-stop, rather than one-stop versus two-stop, which rarely happens nowadays regardless anyway. That's an option, but again, the FIA finding themselves under some degree of fire, because maybe the solution is to make the tyres better, not like that's exactly the stewards doing, but of course Formula 1 makes the rules for how they're going to decide that. This solution seems, I wouldn't say concerning, because I think they can find a way from a safety perspective that this might be okay, but it's certainly not the best solution, I would say, to the problem. Let's talk 26, Williams. Apparently, they have now fully switched their focus to next year's car. This has been a big talking point of the last couple of days because Williams have had such a great start to the season. 25 points on the board already. They scored double points again in Jeddah. Alex Albon has been scoring the majority of their points, but over the last couple of Grand Prix, Sainz is starting to get closer to where he needs to be after a tricky start to the year. But Albon says, now is the time. Make hay while the sun shines, because he expects other teams around them in the championship to bring upgrades that he is not expecting Williams to necessarily do, especially because the big rumour has it that Williams have now fully switched their focus 100% to the 2026 car. And reportedly, this makes them the first team to do so. So we have 11 teams on the grid next year. We'll talk about Cadillac, because of course they're not focusing on this year, are they? So, technically they're focusing fully on next year as well. But of all the other teams up and down the grid, they are still apparently having some focus on 2025 for now, and then that will largely shift in full force for the other teams over to 2026 in due course. Aston Martin, interesting to imagine what they're up to, because of course you've got Adrian Newey, who is definitely fully focused on 2026, but maybe there is still a feeling that, okay, Aston, we need to do something, change this, change that, change the other. But Williams, I imagine, have some other developments maybe in the pipeline still, but it's all of their focus now is on 26. And why might it not be, right? I mean, they had a good year. Their car's going to be good enough to score intermittent points regardless. Maybe other teams catch up and overtake them, but other teams will have to follow suit on this in due course as well. The teams that might not are the teams fighting for the title, right? If you look at the Ferraris, the McLarens, I mean, okay, I say Ferrari as if they're competing. Certainly McLaren and Red Bull and Mercedes to some degree, they will have to maintain some focus on this year, because otherwise they're potentially going to squander a title. McLaren aren't that far ahead that they can afford just to give up on this year's car and focus on next year. Max is going to be competitive, and also Red Bull want to make Max win the title too. They say that they're probably going to be more committed than any team to this year's car development. Williams next year have a Mercedes power unit. That might be the best power unit. Are they going to be a better car than Mercedes, a better car than Alpine, a better car than certainly McLaren? That seems very unlikely, but if there was a chance for Williams to go from obviously being a legendary Formula 1 team to being absolutely nowhere for several years, finally back to some degree of respectability, and potentially go even further, Williams, this is their attempt to do exactly that. Ferrari may have to consider something similar at some point relatively soon, though. We can't rule that out. As I say, I want to put Ferrari in that conversation for the title, but realistically, especially because of the disqualifications in China, they're so far behind in drivers and in constructors that, I don't know, I want to say by Monaco, they might have to come to the realization that, this season is done. There is no chance of us turning it around. Maybe Spain will give some insight into, okay, maybe McLaren struggle because of the flexi wings. That's what Red Bull think anyway. But I kind of doubt that to some degree, that McLaren are going to fall off drastically to such an extent that all of a sudden Ferrari are right there. there's obviously problems that Ferrari need to solve. The qualifying and race discrepancy is a big deal they're still thinking about. There's also talk that the Ferrari car struggles more in dirty air than other cars do, which is pretty interesting to think about. Leclerc says the car feels much better in clean air, which is true for every car, so that's not a massive surprise. But it seems like it just is a thing that some cars are more prone to being affected by the dirty air than some other cars. The McLaren does not seem to be great with it either. I think the Mercedes maybe is better than most, but of course this past Grand Prix they cooked their tyres anyway. But it does seem like the SF25's front wing especially loses a lot of performance in the dirty air, and they really struggle in that scenario, right? So, that makes it again more of a qualifying world championship, right? You qualify in front, you're in a better position already. So Ferrari are trying to fix this for Imola, but it's certainly not going to be something that is going to be fixed easily at all. But let's talk about Red Bull and, well, a former Max Verstappen teammate of Red Bull and where he may end up next. Max could go somewhere as well. There's obviously been talk about Mercedes. There's been talk about Aston Martin. James Vowles of Williams said the other day that he wouldn't sign Max to Mercedes because he effectively comes with some baggage. He comes with some downsides. Günther Steiner says, well, yeah, but if you want to win world championships, you'll take the downsides for the upside in performance. Total Wolff, they may say that, well, if our engine's the best and we better integrate our chassis with the engine for 2026, then even if Russell isn't as good as Verstappen, he is, he's kind of like a politician in a sense, right? George isn't going to cause any issues with the team. He's always going to praise the team. He's not got like an entourage that could cause issues politically, which Verstappen potentially has. And if everything is good enough at Mercedes, then they may say, we don't need Max at the end of the day. But of course, they will not shy away from those type of conversations. And neither will Helmut Marko, because this is what he does. He turns 82 years old today, so happy birthday to Helmut. He's still going, right? The guy, obviously, still working with the Red Bull Junior program and all that, and he certainly has his thoughts on certain drivers. He's been impressed by Isaac Hadjar so far this year. He's been impressed by Yuki Tsunoda for the last several years, and believes that Yuki's doing a commendable job at Red Bull for now. But of course, Yuki will need to keep getting better and better if he wants to ensure that that seat remains his for the longer term. But Marko did comment on the championship battle and who is really the main challenger. Going into this season, I think many, including myself, expected of the McLaren boys, Lando would give Max the stiffest competition, and maybe that will still prove to be true. Is Max, the fastest man on the grid? Yes. Is Lando the faster of the two McLaren drivers? With everything else being equal, I still think yes, but everything else is not equal, and certainly it's not equal the level of pressure that these guys seem to feel. I mean, it's like water off a duck's back to Piastri. He steps into the ring, the pressure's on him, and he delivers a very cool, calm situation, very rarely gets emotional on the radio. I mean, we only really heard him getting emotional when he has, when he was in traffic a little bit and there was that red flag that he thought he saw on the balcony. Like, we're not really hearing much from Oscar on that. You definitely see it more on Lando, right, wearing his heart on his sleeve and all this. And Marko's confirms, as far as he's concerned, Piastri is establishing himself as the main challenger for the championship. And right now, it's tough to deny that looks like the case. I do still think, though, it's a long season ahead. I think Lando will have his good run of form at some point. I think that Piastri's run of form at some point may come to an end. But over the final couple of Grand Prix that we've had so far this year, Piastri has expertly executed. I mean, given that he ended, P9, the first race of the season in Australia, the comeback from then to lead the championship has been incredibly impressive. That's all you can really say. But he may have some interesting challenges on the grid next season. And let's go to Cadillac F1. So, Cadillac are coming in. You guys are obviously excited, I imagine, for an 11th Formula 1 team to be back on the grid. They will be Ferrari powered for the next 3 years at the very least, before General Motors will presumably make an engine for the team at some point. The big question with Cadillac is, because no one's expecting them to be that competitive, let's be real, but it's just going to be exciting to have another team, I think, on the grid and have more opportunities for other drivers to stay and get into the sport. I think there's, the fans were always fully in favour of the 11th Formula 1 team. The FIA was in favour of the 11th Formula 1 team. The teams were generally not, because they have to split the pie one more way. But I think the big excitement around Cadillac isn't really how they're going to perform. It's probably more so because, okay, American team, that's exciting for the first place. Okay, Haas are kind of American, but let's be real, doesn't really feel like it a lot of the time. Cadillac have pitched themselves because, of course, previously it was Andretti, right? And Andretti is still kind of involved, but they're not really being talked about quite as much. But it's very clearly an American project, and that's the intention behind all the branding and the messaging and all that. So there's some excitement going on there. But the major point of contention is, who are they going to field from a driver perspective? What does that look like? Is that exciting or not? So for some time, Sergio Perez has been considered the front-running option. And this is probably true for a couple of reasons. Partially, I imagine what's happened lately at Red Bull, right? Because Perez had a stinky end to last year. He had a terrible end to 2023 as well, really. But Lawson's performance, and even to some degree Tsunoda's performance so far, well, I think Tsunoda's been better on average than Perez or Lawson were. I think it's shown that Perez definitely, looked a bit hard done by in hindsight, just because his replacements have not exactly done a stellar job immediately. Now, you might blame some of that on Perez, because there is a theory that, well, Max made his points very clear in terms of car development direction. Maybe Perez's feedback and, let's say discussions with the engineers wasn't quite as strong. So maybe on some level he dug his own grave over the last couple of years. And another team will obviously not want that to happen to them if they develop the car in a certain way, which isn't exactly optimal. On occasion, he held his own against Max and, he's a proven race-winning driver who has won Constructors' Championships with the team. The other option, of course, would, in that kind of position with veteran driver who can do a job for a team, who's been around the block and done everything, would be Valtteri Bottas, right? And look, if I had to just choose with no consideration, let's say, for, economic factors, I would choose Bottas over Perez. I think he's the superior driver personally, but Perez has a lot to bring to the table. I mean, look, Cadillac, American team from the Americas, certainly Perez from Mexico has huge sponsor value there. As we know, this is the reason why Red Bull struggled to get rid of him for so long, and they eventually did. And Cadillac are probably going to have a very difficult time, given that you probably need a veteran, experienced driver who's been there and he's done it. The options are Perez, the options are Bottas, and maybe let's say Kevin Magnussen or something like that. There's other options out there too, but certainly as former Formula One drivers, those guys are near the top of the list. Magnussen has some experience with the Andretti program, I think, as well. But of the options, when you consider the economic factors, Perez just makes a load of sense, I think, for Cadillac. So I'm expecting that to happen. But his other teammates, that's maybe the big question of the day, because I thought that Cadillac, even if they do get Perez, they might want to get an American driver. There's been talk about Colton Herta, of course, who may well be linked to the team as well. And there's other options out there. People obviously throw the likes of a Mick Schumacher in the conversation or a Felipe Drugovich in the conversation. And, I'm sure you guys have your thoughts in the comment section below as well. But apparently the leading contender is Zhou Guanyu. Now, this makes sense for a couple of reasons. Firstly, critical to note, Zhou has been part of the Ferrari Driver Academy now for pretty much his entire career. Cadillac will be a Ferrari-powered team for those couple of seasons. That relationship makes sense. The Chinese sponsor backing plus appeal to the Chinese market that many of these auto manufacturers want to achieve, that makes sense as well. Is Zhou the best option? Let's be real here. A Perez-Zhou driver lineup, it ain't great, right? It's not great. It's not setting the world alight in terms of performance, in my opinion, and I don't think it's going to deliver the team excellent results. But if the car isn't very good anyway, given all of the circumstances in play and the commercial appeal of some of these teams and the economic factors in play, it is maybe the most likely driver lineup as it stands, given all the relevant factors. Is it what I would do if I could just choose my drivers for the team? I'm not choosing probably either of these guys, to be honest. But if I was working for Cadillac and making the calls, I'm probably choosing both of these guys, because I can totally see why it makes an awful lot of sense. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. And if this is the lineup for next year and Perez is back in with Zhou alongside him, how are they going to get on, right? In a very different machinery. We'll see. I've not got big faith in Cadillac right now anyway. Who knows how Ferrari's engine is going to be next year anyway. Maybe it's rapid and this team's all of a sudden good. And I don't have much faith in a driver lineup either, but still it is a big talking point going into next year. Intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing. Only 3 drivers have won races so far this year. Piastri, Lando, Max. Will anyone join the list, or when's that going to happen, right? Is it going to be a George Russell? Is it going to be a Kimi Antonelli? Or is it going to be either of the Ferrari guys? That is the big question. But speaking of Russell, right, Only driver to have qualified in the top 5 for every Grand Prix. Piastri's qualified in the top 3 for every Grand Prix, which is particularly impressive given where he currently stands. And just to finish up with one final stat, before Miami last year and since Miami last year, because he was on pole there, didn't win the Grand Prix. Look, does this stat show, wow, Max has fallen off, this guy is terrible? Because his ratio of pole to win used to be 84% before last year's Miami. Since and including that Grand Prix, it's been 40%, which I think goes to show you everything you need to know. That is Max driving worse now than he did then? No. It's a lot about the car. So that's why a lot of the time these stats are, and I know that Daniel knows this when he's putting it out here, right? That these stats aren't necessarily the most relevant, but they are definitely interesting. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.